It was the sort of afternoon that St. Mary Mead did best. Sunlight draped lazily across clipped lawns, the air scented with scones, roses, and scandal. The annual Garden Society tea was underway at the vicarage, and half the village had turned out to admire Mrs. Bantry's hybrid tea roses and whisper about the new tenant at Rose Cottage. Lace dresses fluttered, teaspoons clinked, and polite laughter rippled beneath the drone of bees. It was all very English, until the scream came. Moments before, Miss Marple had been seated quietly beneath a striped parasol, knitting what appeared to be a rather complicated pattern of alternating greens and pinks. She had been listening, not to the vicar's wife's tedious recounting of fertilizer ratios, but to the tone behind Mrs. Bartlett's flustered remark about the new lodger. A woman living alone at her age. It's simply not proper. Miss Marple had smiled faintly, noting the insecurity behind the disapproval, and was about to reply when the cry split through the roses. It came from the west side of the garden, where the competition entries were displayed. By the time anyone reached the sound, Mrs. Bantry's prized rosebed was trampled, and in the middle of it lay a man. He was face down, a dark stain spreading beneath his shoulder, one hand clutching a crushed bloom. The crowd froze in collective disbelief. Miss Hartnell dropped her teacup. Colonel Melchett, red-faced and decisive as always, barked orders for someone to fetch the doctor, though it was clear the man had already left the company of the living. As confusion broke into chatter, theories bloomed faster than the roses. "Heart attack, surely," said Mrs. Bartlett. "Nonsense. Look at that mark," countered young Dr. Haynes. "A quarrel, I'd wager," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley. "Men don't die quietly in rosebeds without a reason." Miss Marple said nothing. She merely adjusted her shawl and looked not at the body, but at the petals scattered around it. White petals tinged faintly crimson. Her eyes moved from the flowers to the cup overturned near the edge of the bed, to the faint trail of muddy footprints leading toward the path. Everyone else seemed intent on identifying the victim. Mr. Lionel Kent, the newcomer from London. But Miss Marple's mind was already tracing the invisible threads that had led him to this untimely end. When Inspector Cray from Much Benham arrived, brisk, efficient, and faintly patronizing, he took immediate charge. "An unfortunate business," he said, crouching beside the body. "Likely a quarrel over property or some village misunderstanding. These things happen." Miss Marple smiled faintly again. "Oh, yes," she murmured, as if agreeing. "They do happen, but rarely without warning signs. Roses, you know, must be carefully tended, or they turn upon those who plant them." The inspector, misinterpreting her gentle tone as senile rambling, nodded absently and turned to his notes. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the broken bloom still clutched in the dead man's hand, and the faint, sweet trace of almond that lingered on the breeze. She closed her knitting bag. Something in St. Mary Mead had just begun to unravel. The body was removed just after dusk, when the last of the villagers had drifted away in small, murmuring groups, their voices hushed as though afraid of being overheard by the rose bushes themselves. Miss Marple lingered by the vicar's gate, her knitting still tucked neatly under her arm. She had spoken little since the discovery, though her sharp eyes had taken in far more than anyone realized. The tremor in Mrs. Bantry's voice, the peculiar way Dr. Haynes avoided looking at the teacups, and the faintest flicker of satisfaction on Mrs. Bartlett's face when the inspector had declared it likely poison. By evening, the village was alive with speculation. At the Blue Boar, the local men argued over whether Mr. Kent had enemies. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley confided to anyone who would listen that the Londoner had come to escape something shameful. And at the vicarage, poor Mrs. Bantry kept insisting she would never again host a garden tea, her roses having been forever desecrated. In the midst of all this uproar, Miss Marple sat quietly in her sitting room, the ticking of the clock steady against the whisper of her thoughts. She had known Lionel Kent only in passing. A reserved man, polite enough but never warm. He had moved into Rose Cottage 3 months prior, taking the lease from old Mr. Willard. There had been whispers then, too. That he had money, though no one knew from where. That he had a visitor from London once a week, always a woman, always veiled. Miss Marple had watched them from her window once, the woman's gloved hand trembling as she passed through the gate. Such details had seemed curious then. Now they were quietly damning. The next morning, Inspector Cray came calling. He found Miss Marple tending her violets as though nothing in the world could be more ordinary. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his hat tucked awkwardly beneath his arm. "Thought you might have seen something yesterday. You were sitting close to the rose beds, weren't you?" She looked up, her expression mild. "Close enough to notice the petals, Inspector. They were quite crushed. I do hope Mrs. Bantry won't blame me for that." The inspector gave a short laugh. "I doubt she blames you for anything, Miss Marple. You've a good reputation for observation." "Observation can be misleading," she replied. "People see what they expect. A smile, for example, can hide a grudge, and silence can conceal fear. But tell me, Inspector, have you learned what caused poor Mr. Kent's death?" "Cyanide," Cray said bluntly. "Dr. Haynes confirmed it this morning. Poisoned at the tea, most likely. Someone slipped it into his cup." Miss Marple's fingers paused over the leaves of a violet. "Ah," she said softly. "That explains the smell of almonds. Such a curious scent to find among roses." Cray frowned. "You noticed that?" "I did. Though what interested me more," she continued, "was that Mr. Kent never finished his tea. His cup was half full when he fell. That means the poison must have been strong, or placed where he'd taste it early." The inspector scribbled something in his notebook, clearly uncertain whether he was being led or lectured. "You think someone meant to kill him quickly?" Miss Marple smiled, that faint, knowing smile that had unnerved more than one policeman. "Oh, quite. There are murders born of rage and murders born of calculation. This was the latter. Rage leaves a mess. Calculation leaves patterns." As the inspector left, she watched him walk briskly down the lane, his boots crunching on the gravel. Behind her, the clock chimed 11. She turned back to her violets, but her mind was already in the garden again. The overturned cup, the faint trail of mud, the way Mrs. Bartlett had gasped, a moment too late. By afternoon, news had spread that the mysterious veiled woman from London had been seen arriving at Rose Cottage 2 days before the garden party, and had not been seen leaving. Mrs. Price Ridley swore she'd heard voices in the night. The village's curiosity, always fragile and eager, now turned feverish. But Miss Marple thought not of London women or midnight quarrels. She thought of roses, particularly white ones. They did not turn crimson easily. For that to happen, something had to be spilled, something dark, something deliberate. And so, while the village speculated and the inspector drew up lists of suspects, Miss Marple quietly prepared for her morning visit to Rose Cottage. To pay her condolences, of course, and perhaps to tend to the roses that now grew over the shadow of death. The next morning dawned cool and pale, with a thin veil of mist drifting over the hedgerows. Miss Marple, wrapped in a soft grey shawl, set out along the lane toward Rose Cottage. It was an unassuming little place. Whitewashed walls, blue shutters, a small garden that had once been lovingly kept, but now looked rather neglected. The roses there were overgrown, their blooms heavy, their stems thorny and tangled. It seemed oddly fitting, Miss Marple thought, that beauty left untended could so quickly become perilous. A constable stood by the gate, looking somewhat uncertain about his post. "Inspector Cray's orders, ma'am," he said politely when Miss Marple approached. "Nobody's to disturb the scene." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of disturbing anything," she replied pleasantly. I only came to pay my respects. I was rather fond of Mr. Kent's roses, you know. They had a way of catching the light." The constable hesitated, then stepped aside. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in that." Inside, the cottage was as tidy as one might expect of a bachelor with city habits. The sitting room held a faint smell of tobacco and polish, but also, unmistakably, perfume. Something floral but sharp, like gardenia. Miss Marple's eyes swept gently over the room, a cup still resting on a saucer, a faint ring on the tablecloth, and beside it, a letter. Not quite tucked away, but placed as though waiting to be noticed. She did not touch it, of course, but she read the corner of the envelope. "Miss E. Morland, 42 Bruton Street, London." "Someone's been here," said a voice behind her. Inspector Cray stood in the doorway, his expression tight. "The door was bolted last night. This morning it wasn't, and that letter wasn't where we left it." "People who come to remove things," said Miss Marple gently, "often make the mistake of tidying as they go. A natural impulse, especially for women." Cray frowned. "You think the woman from London came back?" "Oh, perhaps not. Or perhaps she never left." Her tone was mild, almost apologetic, but her eyes rested meaningfully on the narrow staircase. The inspector followed her gaze, then motioned to the constable outside. Moments later, the small upstairs bedroom was opened. The air inside was close, carrying a scent of lavender water. The bed was neatly made, but on the chair near the window lay a silk glove, and a train ticket to London dated the morning after the murder. Miss Marple looked at it thoughtfully. "A woman plans her escape before she runs," she murmured. "But if she did not use the ticket, she must have had reason to stay." Cray crossed his arms. "You believe she killed him?" "I believe she feared him," Miss Marple said softly. "Fear and guilt can look very much alike, Inspector. One trembles, the other hides. The difference is in the eyes." They descended the stairs in silence. Outside, the mist had lifted, revealing the quiet order of the village once more. A milk cart rattled past. Somewhere, a dog barked. Everything appeared peaceful, yet there was a tension in the air, something unspoken pressing at the edges of calm. That afternoon, Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Bantry, who was still distraught over her ruined roses. Between sympathetic clucks and assurances, Miss Marple listened. Not to the words, but to the patterns of them. Mrs. Bantry mentioned that Mrs. Bartlett had been awfully nervous at the garden party, that she'd spilled her tea twice and kept glancing toward the hedge. "The hedge?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "Yes, dear, near where poor Mr. Kent was standing before he—" Mrs. Bantry stopped herself with a shudder. "It's ghastly to think of." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, watching the faint whirlpool of milk. "You know, my dear, roses have thorns for protection, but people develop their own. Gossip, secrets, debts of the heart, and sometimes those pierce much deeper." When she left the Bantry house, twilight was falling. She paused at the end of the lane, looking back toward the vicarage garden. Somewhere within that neat enclosure lay not only the memory of death, but also the seed of motive. She could feel it, faint, tangled, waiting to bloom. And as she walked home beneath the dimming sky, she made a small, decisive note in her mind. Tomorrow she would have a quiet word with Mrs. Bartlett, not about roses this time, but about fear, and what or whom she had been watching that afternoon. The following morning, Miss Marple found herself standing at Mrs. Bartlett's gate, the sound of church bells drifting faintly through the cool air. The widow lived alone in a tidy little cottage fringed with lavender, the scent heavy and sweet. When she opened the door, her smile was polite but strained, the kind of smile that hides more than it reveals. "My dear Miss Marple," she said quickly, "how kind of you to call. I was just about to take my tea. Won't you come in?" Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes quietly taking in the polished furniture, the lace doilies, the small photograph of a man in uniform placed precisely on the mantel. Everything about the room suggested control, a need for order that bordered on anxiousness. Mrs. Bartlett poured the tea with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from age or nerves it was difficult to say. "I imagine," Miss Marple began gently, "that you've had little peace since the dreadful business at the vicarage. Such shocks do unsettle one." Mrs. Bartlett's spoon clinked against her cup. "It's all anyone talks about," she said, her voice too brisk. "Poor Mr. Kent. To think he should come to such an end here, in our quiet village. One never expects it, does one?" "No," Miss Marple replied softly. "One never expects it. And yet people sometimes carry with them a shadow, even into the most peaceful of gardens." She sipped her tea delicately, her gaze steady over the rim of her cup. "You seemed rather distressed that afternoon. I recall you dropped your cup." Mrs. Bartlett's eyes flickered. Yes, it slipped. I'm not accustomed to such scenes. It was the shock of it all." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said with her usual mildness. "Though I wonder, was it the body itself that frightened you, or something you saw just before?" There was a pause, a fraction too long. Mrs. Bartlett reached for her handkerchief, dabbing at her lips though there was no tea upon them. "I didn't see anything," she said finally. "Just chaos. People shouting, Mrs. Bantry fainting." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Yes, poor Mrs. Bantry. But you were looking toward the hedge, weren't you? The one near the west border." The widow froze, her hand still clutching the handkerchief. "How observant you are, Miss Marple. Yes, I thought I saw someone there. A woman, I think, but it was only a glimpse. She wore a dark hat." "And you didn't mention this to Inspector Cray?" "I wasn't sure. I didn't want to make trouble. It could have been anyone." "Indeed it could," Miss Marple agreed, setting down her cup with care. "But I do think you saw something important, my dear. Something that frightened you more than you care to admit." Mrs. Bartlett's eyes darted toward the mantelpiece, to the photograph of the man in uniform. Her voice faltered. "You don't understand, Miss Marple. It's not what you think. Sometimes people return to remind us of mistakes we've made. Mr. Kent, he knew things about my late husband, things best forgotten." Miss Marple's expression softened. "And yet, things rarely stay forgotten, do they? They have a way of blooming again, rather like roses in summer." The widow looked away, her composure cracking for just a moment. "If you speak to Inspector Cray, please don't mention I said anything. I couldn't bear to be mixed up in it." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said kindly, rising to leave. "But if anything more should come to mind, even the smallest trifle, you mustn't hesitate." Outside, the morning had turned bright. The air carried the faint hum of bees and the distant sound of the baker's cart. Miss Marple walked slowly down the lane, her thoughts knitting themselves together like the rows of a half-finished shawl. A woman in a dark hat near the hedge, a letter addressed to London, the faint smell of gardenia in Mr. Kent's cottage, and now a hint, barely spoken, of old secrets tied to a dead husband's name. By the time she reached her gate, she had decided upon her next step. She would call upon Dr. Haynes in the afternoon, not for her health, of course, but for conversation. After all, Miss Marple had long learned that doctors in small villages knew as much about hearts as they did about ailments, especially the kinds of hearts that broke in silence and killed in whispers. Dr. Haynes lived just beyond the church in a modest brick house whose front garden smelled faintly of mint and liniment. Miss Marple arrived promptly after luncheon, her visit announced by the gentle rattle of the iron gate and the soft scrape of her walking stick against the path. The doctor, a neat, middle-aged man with thinning hair and a habit of glancing at his watch even when off duty, greeted her with polite surprise. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure. I trust you're keeping well." "Well enough," she said, settling into the chair he offered by the hearth. "Though I confess, I've found the air in St. Mary Mead a little heavy of late. Tragedy, you know, lingers longer than weather." Dr. Haynes smiled faintly, as though humoring her. Yes, quite the dreadful business. I've been up half the night writing my report for Inspector Cray. A clear case of poisoning. Cyanide, without a doubt. You'd be astonished how swift it acts. Poor fellow didn't stand a chance. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, I wouldn't say astonished, Doctor. I remember a case some years ago. A gardener in Much Benham who rather carelessly left his seed dressing in the shed. It was cyanide too, if I recall. He didn't mean to die, of course. Only meant to frighten his wife. But people do underestimate the efficiency of certain things." Dr. Haynes chuckled softly, but there was a slight tension in his voice when he said, "Yes, well, Mr. Kent's death was no accident. Someone wanted him gone. He was a difficult man, by all accounts." "So I've heard," Miss Marple said mildly, "though he seemed quite polite when I met him. Reserved, but not unpleasant. He must have had some acquaintances, I suppose. People he trusted." The doctor hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "He came to me once, you know, about a month ago. Said he'd been having fainting spells, headaches, and trouble sleeping. I found nothing wrong with him physically, but his nerves. He was frightened of something. Kept glancing at the window as though he expected someone to appear there. I suggested a tonic, but he refused. Said he didn't trust medicines." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "Did he say what frightened him?" "Only that he'd made an error," Haynes replied, "and that someone from his past meant to see him punished for it. I assumed it was business. City men have all sorts of entanglements, you know." "Indeed they do," she said softly. "And some of those entanglements bloom quite beautifully in a village once planted." Haynes gave her a quizzical look. "You think his past followed him here?" "Oh, I hardly think anything yet, Doctor. I merely notice things, like how fear leaves its traces. It lingers in gestures, in glances, even in the tone of a conversation. Much like illness, in its way." He smiled indulgently. "You've missed your calling, Miss Marple. You'd have made a fine detective." She rose, taking her gloves from the armrest. "Oh no, Doctor. I've simply spent too much time observing human nature. It's rather like gardening. Every weed, every bloom, they all tell you something about what's been sown." As she stepped outside, the afternoon light had grown sharper, the sort of crispness that comes before a storm. Along the lane she could see Mrs. Price Ridley speaking to the postman with uncharacteristic animation. A letter, she realized, had just arrived. And from the gleam of gossip in the woman's eyes, it was already half the village's concern. When Miss Marple reached her own gate, she saw the postman approaching, holding out an envelope. "From London, miss," he said cheerfully. "Ah," she replied, taking it. "London does have a habit of sending us surprises." The letter was from her niece, as it turned out, but inside it was a clipping, a small piece torn from a newspaper. Her niece often sent her such things, assuming she liked reading about curious crimes. Miss Marple's eyes, however, caught immediately on the name printed near the bottom of the column. Evelyn Morland, formerly of Bruton Street, charged in connection with a fraud case involving Lionel Kent and Coopers. She folded the clipping neatly, a faint smile touching her lips. The roses, she thought, were beginning to bloom in earnest now, and if she was not mistaken, the next petal to unfurl would reveal the connection between a frightened London woman and a dead man in a quiet village. That evening, she wrote a short note to Inspector Cray suggesting, ever so gently, that he look again into the origin of the tea served at the garden party, particularly who had poured Mr. Kent's cup. Then she extinguished the lamp, the faint scent of her own violets mingling with the whisper of the night air. Somewhere beyond her window, a dog barked once and fell silent. It was the kind of silence that waited for something to be uncovered, and Miss Marple, with her needles poised above soft wool, was patient enough to wait with it. The morning after the letter arrived, St. Mary Mead woke beneath a thin drizzle that turned the cobblestones slick and glistening. Miss Marple, undeterred by the weather, sat by her window with a shawl around her shoulders, reading over the newspaper clipping once more. The name Evelyn Morland seemed to hover on the page, as though waiting to be spoken aloud. A woman wronged, or perhaps complicit. One could never be sure. Human nature, Miss Marple thought, had a way of blurring such distinctions. By mid-morning, Inspector Cray came calling again, his expression a mixture of weariness and curiosity. He carried his hat in one hand, and a faint air of reluctant respect. "I had your note, Miss Marple," he began. "We've been through every cup from that tea party. Mrs. Bantry's maid swears she poured most of them herself, but one cup was passed along the table to Mr. Kent by Mrs. Bartlett." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Mrs. Bartlett," she repeated softly, as though tasting the name. "Yes, that does fit rather neatly, doesn't it? Though I doubt she realized it at the time." Cray frowned. "You think she was tricked?" "Oh, not quite tricked. Simply persuaded. You see, Inspector, in every village there is someone who believes a small deceit can do no harm, especially when cloaked in good manners. Mrs. Bartlett is precisely that sort. If someone she trusted asked her to exchange a cup, she would do so without hesitation, perhaps even feeling virtuous about it." He shifted uneasily. "But who'd ask her to do such a thing?" "That," Miss Marple said, "depends on whom she was trying to protect, or whom she feared." She reached for her teacup and took a slow sip before continuing. "Tell me, Inspector, did you happen to notice a faint scent of gardenia when you visited Rose Cottage?" Cray blinked. "Gardenia? No, can't say I did." "Why?" "It's a perfume not easily forgotten. Too strong for daily wear, really, but useful for a woman wishing to be noticed and yet remain indistinct. I believe the woman from London, Evelyn Morland, wore it, and I rather suspect she has not gone back to London at all." Cray's eyes narrowed. "You think she's still here, but we've searched every house in the village." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, yes. You've searched the houses of the living, but have you considered the habits of the fearful? They tend not to flee outward, but inward, into hiding places already familiar to someone else." She set her cup down with a quiet clink. "I wonder, Inspector, did anyone think to look in the old gardener's shed behind Rose Cottage?" Within the hour, Cray had assembled 2 constables and returned to the cottage. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground damp and fragrant. They moved cautiously around the back, where the shed door stood half open, its padlock broken. The air inside smelled of soil and mildew, and something else. A chair had been dragged to the corner. A blanket lay crumpled beside it, and on the small work table, under a smear of dust, was a glass vial, empty but faintly scented of almonds. Cray turned to Miss Marple, who had followed at a polite distance, her eyes calm and observant. "She was here," he said quietly. "She must have been hiding since the murder." Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, and she stayed until last night, I should think. See how the chair's damp on one side but dry beneath? She left when the rain began, likely through the woods, toward the station." Cray cursed softly. "We'll telegraph the stations at once." But Miss Marple was still studying the work table. Her gloved fingers brushed against a folded scrap of paper beneath the vial. It was a torn piece of the same letter she'd seen in Kent's cottage, the handwriting small and elegant. "He said he'd ruin me if I spoke. I only wanted what he owed." She handed it to the inspector. "There it is, you see. Not vengeance, desperation, the sort that drives people to acts they neither planned nor fully understand." Cray pocketed the paper grimly. "So it was her after all." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, looking toward the distant line of trees, "though I rather think someone helped her. Evelyn Morland may have poured the poison, but another hand placed it where she could find it, and that, Inspector, is the difference between a guilty soul and a clever one." He stared at her. "You're saying there's someone else behind this?" "Oh, yes," she murmured, her gaze still fixed on the fading trail that led toward the station. "There's always someone else. The true murderer is usually the one who never runs." As they left the garden, the roses stirred faintly in the breeze, their petals wet and gleaming as if listening. Miss Marple walked home in silence, her mind turning over the pattern forming in the threads of the case. A frightened woman, a London scandal, a poison in a teacup, and a widow who trembled too soon. The truth, she knew, was not far now. It was there, hidden among the roses, waiting for her to lift the final thorn. That evening, the lamps in St. Mary Mead glowed softly through the mist, and the air carried the hush of a village holding its breath. Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting untouched, her gaze unfocused, following thoughts that moved quietly but with purpose. The revelation in the gardener's shed had shifted the air of the case, from mere curiosity to something colder, more deliberate. Evelyn Morland had fled, but her escape felt too neat, too conveniently timed. It had the mark of orchestration, and orchestration required a conductor. She had just reached this conclusion when there came a firm knock at the door. It was Inspector Cray, his face damp from the fog and his expression unusually grave. "We've found her," he said without preamble. "Evelyn Morland, or what's left of her." Miss Marple's hands tightened on the arms of her chair. "Dead. In the brook just outside Much Benham. She must have fallen in during the rainstorm. There's no sign of struggle, but—" He hesitated, rubbing his brow. "There's something strange about it. She still had a small purse with her, but no ticket, no money, and in her pocket, a note addressed to you." He handed it over. The paper was damp and blurred, the handwriting shaky but still legible. "I didn't mean for it to happen." He said it was only to frighten him. "Please tell them I was sorry." Miss Marple read the note twice, her face unreadable. "Sir," she said softly, "the garden has claimed another bloom." Cray frowned. "You think she was murdered?" "Oh, Inspector, people drown in all sorts of ways," she replied gently. "Sometimes by water, sometimes by fear. But yes, I do believe someone helped her to fall." He looked frustrated. "Then who? We've questioned half the village already." Miss Marple set the note on the table beside her knitting and rose slowly. "If you'd be so kind as to indulge me, Inspector, I think it's time I paid a visit to Mrs. Bartlett once more. There are questions I neglected to ask. About her husband, and about why her eyes filled with tears when she mentioned Mr. Kent's name." The next morning, the sky hung low and grey as Miss Marple made her way up the lane. Mrs. Bartlett opened the door almost before she knocked, her face pale, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, voice trembling, "it's dreadful, isn't it? That poor woman in the brook. I heard it on the wireless this morning. The whole village is talking." "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly. "The village does tend to talk, but sometimes it talks too soon." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "Tell me, my dear, did you know Evelyn Morland?" The widow froze. Why no. How should I?" "Oh, I think you did," Miss Marple replied softly. "Not as Evelyn Morland, perhaps, but as the woman who once visited your husband in London, before the war, when he worked at Kent & Co. He was a bookkeeper there, wasn't he?" Mrs. Bartlett's lips parted, but no sound came. Her eyes darted toward the photograph on the mantel, the man in uniform, and back again. "You see," Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but firm, "Mr. Kent was not merely your husband's employer. He was his creditor, and when your husband died, he left behind not only debts but letters, rather compromising ones. Letters that a certain woman in London might have kept, hoping to use them one day. I imagine she turned up here recently, thinking to make a bargain, and I imagine Mr. Kent refused her." Mrs. Bartlett sank into a chair, her composure slipping like silk from weary hands. "He ruined us," she whispered. "Ruined George. My husband took the blame for his thefts. Kent promised to make it right after the war, but he never did. That woman came to me, said she had proof that would clear George's name if I could pay her fare home. I didn't know she meant to kill him. I swear I didn't." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "No, I believe you. But someone else did. Someone who knew you would be too frightened to speak, too kind to question a request. You see, Mrs. Bartlett, whoever planned this needed you, needed a hand to carry the poisoned cup without realizing its weight." Tears slipped down the widow's cheeks. "But who would—" "The same man who pretended to be shocked at the garden party," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "The one who declared it must be poison before anyone else had reason to think so." "Dr. Haynes," Mrs. Bartlett gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "The doctor? But he was so kind." "Yes. Kind enough to care for Mr. Kent's nerves, kind enough to know precisely what medicine he feared. Cyanide is not difficult for a physician to obtain under the right pretext, and when one has lost money, say to a fraudulent partner like Kent, revenge can wear the face of duty." Outside, the first raindrops began to fall again, tapping against the window pane like quiet punctuation. Miss Marple rose, her voice low but steady. "Do not trouble yourself further, my dear. The truth has a way of surfacing, like oil on water, and now that we know where to look, I think it will rise quite soon." As she stepped back into the rain, she saw Inspector Cray's figure approaching at the bend of the lane. She lifted her hand slightly, signaling him forward. The story, at last, was ready to be told, and the final rose, she thought, was about to be pruned. Inspector Cray arrived just as Miss Marple stepped out into the rain. His coat was buttoned to the throat, his face tight with determination. She greeted him with a small nod, her expression unreadable, though her eyes carried that faint, knowing glimmer that always seemed to precede a revelation. "You've been to Mrs. Bartlett's?" he asked, falling into step beside her. "Yes," she replied quietly. "She's told me enough to confirm what I suspected, but I'm afraid what comes next will not be pleasant for you, Inspector. It's always difficult when a respectable man turns out to be something quite different underneath." Cray frowned. "You're referring to Dr. Haynes, I take it. I must say it's a serious accusation, Miss Marple. He's well regarded here, trusted. I'll need more than suspicions before I can confront him." "Of course," she said mildly. "I wouldn't expect otherwise. But perhaps, before we pay him a visit, you might consider this. Dr. Haynes declared the cause of death almost immediately. No hesitation, no suggestion of apoplexy or stroke, though no one else had thought of poison yet. And his familiarity with cyanide. That's not something every country doctor possesses. Nor," she added gently, "does every man happen to hold a grudge against the deceased strong enough to fester in silence for years." They walked on through the drizzle, the church clock tolling softly in the distance. When they reached the doctor's house, Cray hesitated at the gate. The curtains were drawn, though it was not yet dusk, and the faint light of a fire flickered behind the glass. Miss Marple waited, patient as ever. Dr. Haynes opened the door himself. He looked weary, his tie undone, his composure slightly frayed. "Inspector," he said in surprise. "And Miss Marple. What brings you here at this hour?" Cray's tone was brisk. "A few questions, Doctor, about Mr. Kent, and about Miss Evelyn Morland." The doctor stiffened, though his voice remained steady. "I've already told you what I know. Kent was poisoned, and the woman fled. There's nothing more to add." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, stepping forward. "But I rather think there is. You see, Miss Morland is dead now, found drowned in Much Benham Brook. And before she died, she left a note. A curious thing, really. She said she'd only meant to frighten him, not kill him, which suggests someone else prepared the poison she used, someone who knew its measure well. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock. The doctor's hand moved almost unconsciously toward the arm of his chair, tightening until his knuckles whitened. Cray's eyes narrowed. "You gave her the poison, didn't you, Doctor? You told her it would make Kent ill, that she'd have her revenge without blood on her hands." Dr. Haynes laughed, too suddenly, too sharply. "You're both imagining ghosts. Do you think I'd risk my career, my life, for a woman I barely knew?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost tender. "No, not for her, but for yourself, yes. You see, Evelyn Morland wasn't the first to suffer from Mr. Kent's deceit. He ruined men as easily as he charmed them. He took your savings, didn't he? Promised investments, city connections, repayment after the war, and when you found yourself cornered, you made a bargain of your own. You used the frightened woman he'd betrayed as both weapon and shield." The doctor's composure cracked. "You've no proof," he said hoarsely. "Oh, but we do," Cray replied, reaching into his coat pocket. "A letter from your surgery to Mr. Kent, dated 3 weeks before his death. It's about a financial settlement, one that Kent refused. And there's a second letter, unsigned, found in his drawer, written in your handwriting. It says, 'You've had your last chance.'" For a long moment, Dr. Haynes said nothing. Then he sank into his chair, his breath coming shallow and uneven. "He destroyed everything," he whispered. "Every investment, every hope. Evelyn came to me desperate. She said she wanted him to suffer as he'd made her suffer. I thought—" He stopped, his voice breaking. "I thought a dose small enough would only make him ill. But he must have taken more than I intended. He always drank greedily." Miss Marple's gaze was steady, but not unkind. "That's the trouble with greed, Doctor. It swallows more than one intends to offer." Cray motioned to the constable waiting at the door. The handcuffs clicked softly, almost delicately, as though even justice wished to tread lightly here. The doctor did not resist. He only looked at Miss Marple once, his eyes hollow. "You see too much," he said quietly. "I see only what people choose to hide in plain sight," she replied. When the inspector led him away, Miss Marple lingered in the doorway. The rain had eased, and the air smelled of wet earth and roses. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began to sing. She stood listening for a long moment before turning homeward, her steps unhurried, her face calm. By morning, the village would know everything. The doctor's arrest, the woman's tragic death, the shame of it all. And by evening, the gossip would soften into pity, as it always did in St. Mary Mead. But Miss Marple knew that beneath the pity would lie something sharper, the recognition that evil, in its most polite disguise, often lived nearest the garden gate. As she reached her cottage, she paused by her rose bushes, their petals still glistening with rain. "There now," she murmured, brushing one gently. "No thorns are harmless, are they?" And with that, she went inside, the door closing softly behind her, leaving only the faint perfume of roses lingering in the damp evening air. The next morning arrived pale and quiet, as though the village itself were reluctant to stir. A fine mist clung to the hedgerows, softening the outlines of cottages and fences, while the church bell tolled faintly in the distance. Not for service, but for the slow rhythm of ordinary time resuming after disruption. Yet Miss Marple, seated by her window with her teapot and her knitting basket, knew too well that peace was rarely so simple. Tranquility, she thought, was often a thin blanket laid over restless soil. The newspapers arrived by mid-morning, the front page already whispering the headline, "Local Doctor Arrested in Connection with Poisoning." Miss Marple read it without satisfaction. The truth had been unearthed, yes, but it was a bitter, tangled truth. Evelyn Morland's death had not been a matter of pure guilt or innocence, but of desperation intertwined with deceit. Dr. Haynes had planned carefully, believing himself clever enough to outwit both conscience and chance. Yet human folly, Miss Marple reflected, had a way of blooming where cleverness thought itself safe. A soft knock sounded at the door. When she opened it, Inspector Cray stood there, hat in hand, looking older than he had the day before. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple," he said after a pause. "Without your insight, we might never have uncovered the whole of it. Though I confess, I still don't understand why you suspected him so early." She smiled faintly. It was rather small things, really. The doctor's remark about cyanide at the scene. Far too confident for a man encountering an unexpected death. Then his insistence that poor Evelyn must have fled before there was any evidence she had done so. And of course, the faint smell of gardenia in his surgery. He'd handled something of hers. A scarf, perhaps. And forgotten that scents, like secrets, have a way of lingering. Cray nodded slowly. "We found her handkerchief in his desk drawer this morning, monogrammed. It seems she came to him the night before the murder. He must have given her the vial then." He hesitated, his voice softening. "He's confessed, more or less. Says he meant to frighten Kent, not kill him. But intention matters little when the dead can't speak." Miss Marple's eyes moved toward her garden, where the last of the roses were wilting in the autumn damp. "No," she murmured, "the dead rarely speak. But the living? Oh, they speak endlessly, Inspector. Sometimes with words, sometimes with silence. It's only a matter of listening properly." Cray's expression softened with something like admiration. "You have a way of doing that better than any policeman I know." "Oh, I don't think so," she said modestly. "I simply pay attention. People tell you what they are, if you give them enough quiet to hear it." He smiled faintly, replacing his hat. "We'll close the case tomorrow, officially at least. You've earned a rest, Miss Marple. I hope the village lets you have one." When he left, Miss Marple remained standing by the window, watching as the mist thinned and the faint sun began to glow across the wet rooftops. Children's laughter drifted from the lane. Life, stubborn and ordinary, was returning. Yet she knew that under every quiet exterior lay the same fragile balance. Pride, fear, resentment, love. The forces that could drive a person to tea with friends one day and to murder the next. She turned back to her armchair, setting aside the newspaper and picking up her knitting again. Her hands moved with practiced ease, the rhythm as steady as her thoughts. Somewhere, a bird sang outside, a small, hesitant trill. "Poor Dr. Haynes," she said softly to herself. "And poor Evelyn, one ruined by pride, the other by fear, and both by the same man long before the roses began to bloom." Her needles clicked gently in the quiet room. Outside, the world seemed to breathe again, and the faintest breeze stirred the petals that had fallen from her rose bushes. In St. Mary Mead, the talk would soon turn to other things. The harvest, the church bazaar, the vicar's new sermon. Yet for those who had listened closely, this summer's tale of poison and roses would remain a reminder of what Miss Marple had always known. That behind every lace curtain and polished teacup lies the whole of human nature, waiting to be seen. And with that thought, she smiled, poured herself another cup of tea, and watched the sun finally break through the mist, its light glancing gently across the garden where, beneath the quiet soil, the truth had at last been laid to rest. The following week passed with the quiet steadiness that always followed a scandal in St. Mary Mead. The village had settled into its familiar rhythm once more. Postmen whistling down the lane, hens clucking behind low fences, and the faint hum of gossip drifting like pollen in the morning air. Yet, beneath that polite calm, something still stirred. There were those who found the official account that Dr. Haynes had acted out of desperation and remorse. A little too tidy, and Miss Marple, though she had said nothing to contradict it, felt that faint disquiet too. It began with a small inconsistency. the sort only she would notice. A letter from the vicar's wife, thanking her for being such a comfort during this dreadful affair, had arrived with an enclosure. A note from Mrs. Bantry. Mrs. Bantry, ever fond of little details, mentioned in passing that her maid had found an extra teacup among the rose bushes 2 days after the police cleared the garden. "I'm sure it's nothing," she had written cheerfully, "but I don't remember ever owning one with such a peculiar mark inside. A faint brown ring that won't wash out." Miss Marple read that line twice. A cup with a mark that would not wash away. Not from tea, then. Something more corrosive. Her eyes narrowed slightly as the pattern reassembled itself in her mind. The doctor's guilt was real enough. He had poisoned Mr. Kent, whether by calculation or error. But someone else had ensured his downfall. Someone who had known precisely where to leave that cup and when to make sure it was noticed. That afternoon, she took her umbrella and walked to the vicarage under the pale October sun. Mrs. Bantry was delighted to see her and insisted on showing her the recovered cup. It sat on the pantry shelf, harmless and ordinary at first glance. Fine china, pale cream, a little chipped at the handle. But Miss Marple turned it carefully in her hands and found what she had expected, a tiny hairline crack near the base, faintly stained along the fracture. "You say your maid found it by the roses?" "Yes, dear. Hidden in the soil almost, as though someone had dropped it in a hurry. I dare say it belonged to poor Mr. Kent." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, her voice distant. "Though it's curious, isn't it, that it was found 2 days later? I wonder who might have returned to the garden after the police were done." Mrs. Bantry blinked, puzzled. "Returned? But who would?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is precisely what I mean to find out." Later that evening, as dusk fell over the village, she paid a quiet visit to the police station. Inspector Cray, though surprised to see her, listened patiently as she spoke. "There is a question," she said, "that's been troubling me, about Mrs. Bartlett. We accepted her story, that she was manipulated by Dr. Haynes. But she was also the one who poured the tea, wasn't she? The only one whose hands touched every cup." Cray frowned. "You think she helped him willingly?" "Oh, not willingly," Miss Marple said softly, "but perhaps opportunely. A widow with ruined pride, a husband's reputation destroyed by Mr. Kent's deceit, and a convenient man like Dr. Haynes to take the blame when all was done. I think she played her part more carefully than she ever admitted." The inspector rubbed his chin thoughtfully, but she confessed nothing. "No," Miss Marple replied, "because she didn't have to. She told us just enough to win sympathy, not enough to invite suspicion. It's a very feminine art, Inspector. The art of appearing fragile while quietly holding the knife." The next morning, a constable was sent to Mrs. Bartlett's cottage. She was gone. The rooms were in perfect order, the bed neatly made, the fire set but unlit. Only a single item remained upon the mantel, the photograph of her late husband, face turned slightly toward the window. Behind it, tucked into the frame, they found a small envelope addressed to Miss Marple. It contained only a single sentence, written in a steady, elegant hand. "Some debts can only be settled in silence." Miss Marple stood by her window that evening, reading the note again as the light faded. So, the final thread had been pulled at last. She had been right. There was always someone else. Mrs. Bartlett had waited until the perfect moment, using Dr. Haynes as her instrument of justice, then disappearing quietly before the village could begin to suspect her. It was not triumph Miss Marple felt, but a faint, inevitable sorrow. That same ache she felt every time the truth proved too human to condemn and too cruel to forgive. Outside, the night deepened, and the last of the roses hung heavy with dew. Miss Marple watched them swaying in the breeze, their petals bruised but still fragrant, and whispered to herself, "Human nature, my dear, always finds a way. Whether through kindness or cruelty, or the quiet places in between. Then she folded the note, placed it gently in her drawer among old letters, and solved mysteries, and let the house return to silence. The clock ticked softly, the kettle began to hum, and from the lane came the faint echo of laughter. Life resuming as it always did, while the memory of death faded gently among the roses. The morning after Mrs. Bartlett's disappearance dawned bright and cold, the kind of morning when every sound seemed sharper, every color more distinct. Frost glittered along the hedges, and the air carried that peculiar clarity that comes only after the long fog of uncertainty has lifted. Miss Marple awoke early, her thoughts calm but deliberate. There was, she knew, one final piece left to be set gently in its place. Not for the police, not even for the village, but for her own quiet sense of completion. By mid-morning, she was at the vicarage once again, seated by the fire with her familiar knitting on her lap. The vicar's wife, who had been recounting her version of the whole dreadful business, stopped mid-sentence as Miss Marple spoke softly, almost to herself. It is strange, isn't it, how people imagine justice must always be loud. Handcuffs, headlines, a final confession shouted in tears, but sometimes justice moves quietly, like a shadow across the garden. Mrs. Bantry, who had joined them for tea, gave a wistful sigh. I still can't quite believe Mrs. Bartlett is gone. Such a proper woman, always so polite. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Politeness, my dear, is often the first refuge of the determined. She was not wicked, only wronged, and she believed, quite sincerely, that she had balanced the scales. In her way, she did. The others fell silent, sensing something conclusive in her tone. Miss Marple continued gently, her gaze fixed on the fire. It was not simply revenge that guided her. It was shame. The shame of a woman who had lost her husband to scandal and then watched the man responsible live comfortably among roses and respectability. She poured the tea that day, as she always did. But she poured one cup slightly differently. Not for Mr. Kent, as she told us, but for Dr. Haynes. She knew he would test the taste, pretending medical prudence, as he so often did. And she knew he would recognize the bitterness, that he would realize he had been implicated long before he was ever accused. Mrs. Bantry gasped softly. Then she planned for him to be caught. Not precisely, Miss Marple said, shaking her head. She planned only to remind him, to make him fearful enough to expose himself, to draw the net tighter by his own conscience. When Evelyn Morland died, it completed the tragedy. Mrs. Bartlett hadn't foreseen that. Yet she understood what must follow. Her revenge was complete, but so too was her ruin. A woman like her could not live among whispers, and so she left, taking her secret with her. The vicar's wife dabbed her eyes discreetly. Such dreadful waste, she murmured. Yes, Miss Marple agreed quietly. But then, evil rarely begins with wickedness. More often, it begins with hurt. And a hurt ignored long enough begins to think itself justified. A silence followed, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock and the whisper of the fire. Outside, the frost had begun to melt, drops of water glistening on the rose bushes just beyond the window. The petals had withered now, their beauty fading, but still they held their form, fragile remnants of what had once been radiant. As Miss Marple rose to leave, Mrs. Bantry caught her hand. You always see through people, Jane. I don't know how you bear it. She smiled softly. Oh, my dear, one bears it because one must. There's comfort, I think, in understanding that people, like gardens, grow what they're tended to grow, sometimes roses, sometimes thorns, and often both on the same stem. She stepped out into the crisp air, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. The village lay before her in quiet harmony. Smoke rising from chimneys, the faint murmur of distant conversation, and somewhere the slow toll of the church bell marking another hour past. Life, ordinary and unassuming, went on as it always did. When she reached her gate, Miss Marple paused. The rose bush beside it had lost nearly all its blossoms. Only one pale bloom remained, bowed under the weight of the morning dew. She brushed a droplet from its petal with a gloved finger and whispered, "It's over now, my dear. The garden will rest again." And as she stepped inside her cottage, the faint scent of tea and violets greeted her. The clock ticked evenly on the mantel, marking time's quiet insistence that the world, however troubled, continues. Miss Marple set her kettle upon the hob, took up her knitting, and allowed herself a small, contented sigh. Justice, she thought, need not always thunder. Sometimes it whispers, softly, among the roses.